orient correctly. So today, hopefully, we can approach this topic in a far more civilized manner and get right to the meat of it. So, cold brew tea, it's chemically different, is the name of my little talk. And it's one of my favorite topics, actually, to speak on. Most of us grew up imagining that tea could only be brewed with the hottest water available, right? Those of us who grew up at sea level made it with scalding water. Anyone who's come in contact with British tea culture have heard things like, you need to bring the kettle as close as possible to the pot before you pour it in. And there are great debates about, do you pour the milk in before or after? But it all comes down to getting the hottest possible, lovely, clear, filtered, fresh water in contact with those tea leaves in order to extract the maximum from them. There are two reasons, I believe, that hot brewed tea is the only way that people in the West and in the UK really look at tea. One of them is because by far and away the number one type of tea consumed in the Western world is black tea, the most highly oxidized tea. And the other one is that we generally don't experiment quite so much with tea in our culture. Most of the US does consume tea, but it is sweetened iced tea. So again, a black tea, we like consistency and flavor. Other cultures do sometimes experiment with using tea in cuisine, and of course we're getting to that point in the West, but that's not how we started. So think about it. When you get your hot kettle close to the pot and pour that water on those black tea leaves, you're not only extracting them, but when it's very hot water that those tea leaves are coming in contact with, you're actually cooking them, right? So think about cooking anything in hot water. You're chemically altering the structure of the molecules that are coming out of, be that a tea leaf, a leaf of spinach, kale, a carrot, you name it. When it comes in contact with boiling water, when it's cooked, it's chemically altered. When something gets hit with cold water, it doesn't get necessarily chemically altered. And so that's really where the departure of how cold brew tea tastes versus hot brewed tea comes about. So, cold brewed tea. This is not a tea that has been hot brewed and then chilled. This is not a tea that's been hot brewed and then poured over ice. So understand that cold brewed tea is not just cold tea. It is tea that has been brewed in cold water. Completely counterintuitive, right? I had started a tea company and had worked in that tea company for a few years before I'd even considered the concept of cold brew tea. And we kind of discovered it on our own, and I'll tell that little story in a moment. Of course, we weren't the first people to ever do it. Tea has been cold brewed since its beginning, undoubtedly. But we have definitely advocated for cold brewed tea in the States, and in particular for when you take your tea on the go. We like cold brew to rehydrate with, or cold beverages rather, in the States. That's our preference, as opposed to many other nations that tend to rehydrate with warmer or body temperature beverages. But we like our cold bevies here. So cold brewed tea is a natural because we're suckers for convenience and for cold beverages, and it fits both those bills. So why is it convenient? You don't need a kettle. You don't need any power. You just need some nice fresh water, something to steep it in. I love doing cold brew tea in mason jars. Of course, we've designed a whole line of steepware around brewing tea, but a lot of them are more conducive to cold brew tea. And there's, I'm not going to do a spoiler alert, but there are a few products coming out later this year that are geared entirely for cold brewing from our line. So It's chemically different because it's entirely different extraction method. The leaves infuse more slowly and over a much longer period of time. So, as you can imagine, that would actually extract a different flavor profile. And for many teas, and especially for many high-end teas, it tends to extract more flavor and more antioxidants and less of that bitterness that you can get from overbrewing or from brewing a tea with too hot of water. So in here I have Wild Harvest Green Tea. We'll talk in a moment about which teas we prefer for cold brew. But what I have in here is Wild Harvest Green Pu'erh, which it's kind of a theme on our little 2 o'clock virtualities. This is a real staff favorite at the Tea Spot because we so love the wild tea area where it comes from. It's definitely the most natural and clean tea area that we've ever experienced. And when this tea is cold brewed, it is definitely milder, richer, and smoother. So in general, another reason why cold brew tea is such a great option for US tea drinkers, or North American tea drinkers, I should say, is because it offers a naturally sweet, unsugared, unflavored beverage. I was just talking with my colleague Jessica yesterday about naturally sweet teas, and we were actually debating, do we do a promo around naturally sweet teas? But you know, most Americans are going to think of flavored teas when they think of naturally sweet teas because you're not adding any kind of sweetener to that tea. But as I was preparing for today's talk, I thought, wow, cold brew tea is actually the way that we should define naturally sweet teas. Because if you take the same, let's say green tea, and we'll get to the categories in just a second, I'm kind of jumping ahead. If you take the same green tea, steep it precisely following its instructions, let's say our Japanese orchid sencha, with 170-degree water for 2 or 2.5 minutes, pull out the leaves, and then have one that you cold brewed for 10 minutes, you will undoubtedly perceive some more sweetness in the one that was cold brewed. And it's just a different way, a different order and a different magnitude, and again, less alteration to the chemical molecules that are being extracted from that tea. So it is a more natural, a more gentle, but again, a different tasting extraction than what we're used to if we've only hot brewed tea all our life. In particular, black teas, which are the most highly oxidized, the kind of driest and the most, for lack of a better term, denatured from the fresh tea leaf, those are going to extract way differently when you do a cold brew. And now let's go ahead and talk about the different tea types. Black teas are not my favorite to cold brew, but that's for a reason of lack of patience, perhaps. I'm not a great planner. I love to want my tea and then have it within the next 10-15 minutes. And cold brew does that brilliantly with white, green, and oolong teas. So how do you cold brew? Nothing could be easier. You take your 16 to 24 ounces of water, let's say, for lack of, for being able to do the math easily, for multiples of 8, let's say we take 16 ounces of water. We would add then, same as we might for hot brew, you can either go a little lighter or a little heavier, but I would normally put 2 heaping teaspoons of tea leaves in here, or for a 32-ounce kind of portion, I generally do a heaping tablespoon of leaves, and I often do 32-ounce mason jars of cold brew to kind of get me through an afternoon or a bike ride or whatever. And you just throw those tea leaves in there. It doesn't matter if you add the water first or the leaves first. You combine tea leaves with fresh, cool water, and then you just let it sit for 5 minutes, 10 minutes for a green or white tea. Taste it. Because it's much slower, it really doesn't matter if you wait 8 minutes or 12 minutes. It's going to be very similar. It will be fine if you steep it up to even 2 hours. And the cool thing about cold brewing is you can always repeat the steeps. You can definitely get a good 2 to 3 cold brews out of any kind of tea that you might steep. I would say usually at least 1 steep more than if you were to hot brew that tea. So, best teas to cold brew. White and green teas, there's actually research that shows that the extraction of polyphenol antioxidants when those tea types are cold brewed is higher than when they're hot brewed. Makes sense. They're very delicate, and they're the ones that stand the most kind of, how to put it, the most harm to their tea leaves by being adulterated by heat or being touched by very hot water. Oolongs are probably in the same category. The study didn't actually cover oolong teas, but the differences in flavor in terms of extraction, we've not measured the polyphenol extraction of oolongs at ambient temperature brewing, but their gentle, sweeter taste is also very, very pronounced when you cold brew. My favorite teas to cold brew are oolongs, and actually this green pu'erh as well. And I think it's because I do love my oolongs hot, but I actually prefer the flavor profile when they're cold brewed. I also think that's the type of tea that of its nature, just like Wild Harvest Green Pu'erh, is very mocktail-y in its nature. It's a tea that I'm not embarrassed to serve in beautiful stemware for happy hour to guests, and they'll try it, and it's so complex in its flavor profile that people often think that it's a drink, that it has some kind of alcoholic component or something very obscure. Of course, it is very unique. A great oolong and a great pu'erh are definitely could be far more valuable than even a very high-end cocktail, but it's a very adult kind of flavor profile, very complex, and so clean and different when you steep it at ambient temperature. Yeah, of course, my Wild Harvest I love because it takes me right back to those tea trees that can embrace us in the wild tea forest, and the aroma is right there with the flavor, so that's just great. So green, whites, and oolongs are the teas that I would advocate the most for cold brewing. Black tea, you need to let brew at cold ambient temperatures or cold temperatures for 6 hours or overnight. And when I say ambient or cold, you can either cold brew in the fridge and have your tea cold when it comes out, or you can brew at room temperature. Doesn't make a huge difference. As long as it's room temperature or cooler, you're going to get a very similar cold brew extraction. Herbals. So what I have here in my mason cup is actually our adaptogenic chai. Herbals, you can definitely cold brew. A lot of herbals cold brew fabulously well from a technical perspective. We don't advocate it so strongly anymore because herbals lack the kill step that tea has. So they are not bacteriologically inactive. So in a worst case scenario, an herbal tea, which is just a dried leaf of some herb, could grow salmonella on it. Clearly we get certificates of analysis and ensure that everything that we work on is clean and doesn't have any kind of bacterial activity on it. However, in the worst case, an herbal tea, you would, even if it had something growing on it, if you hit it with boiling water, you're probably going to kill that organism. So you're not at risk if you hot brew an herbal, but if it's got something wrong with it and you cold brew it, or let's say you cold brew some herbs from your garden and put them in the sun, it could start to grow something. But if you hot brew your herbal tea once, which I did with this adaptogenic chai, and then cold brew it the second time, it makes a fabulous, smooth and delicious, very different cold brew. I love it hot and I love it cold brewed. And it's fun to experiment with how different they are. Yerba mates, also cold brew fabulously. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up with respect to fun things to cold brew is the concept of sparkling tea. And I even have a recipe. I believe it's a green sencha with lemon in my Cancer Hates Tea book. And we have a few cold brew recipes. We'll go ahead and post the resource. We wrote this do-it-yourself cold brew guide a few years ago, and it's available, of course, for free on our website. It's a good little resource. It's got about, 12, 13 pages in it with a few recipes. And it does also focus on matcha, which by its nature is one of the most logical teas for us to cold brew, because we can either add it to a smoothie or something, and then of course, and it's not really brewed, it's mixed, but we do include it in our cold brew lifestyle. But our steep and go filters, I used to make sparkling teas quite a bit. I would just get a bottle of sparkling water from the grocery store, and things that I love to add to those. So for instance, I loved putting, and again, this is against what I've just said about not doing with herbals, but I love to add chamomile to sparkling water. And then not being a great gardener, the things that I'm good at growing are lavender and mint, which of course grow like weeds. So I love adding either a tiny bit of fresh lavender or a tiny bit of fresh mint to a chamomile infused sparkling tea. And then with the steep and go filter on top, and I'm sorry, I didn't have any bottles in my fridge at this point, you just can pour it out from the bottle directly after that tea is steeped by opening up, your steep and go lid and pushing on the bottle and getting the tea out. As I said, the one recipe that we have for sparkling green tea, which is also super delicious, is green sencha. I love our orchid green sencha in sparkling water. You can also add a little bit of lemon zest to that on the glass if you like. And then one of my absolute favorites is to either cold brew white tea in coconut water, or to cold brew white tea in your sparkling water and add a little touch of agave. So white tea with a touch of sweetness in a cold brew, delicious as can be, ready in 10 minutes. You can wow your guests with a really fun cocktail next time. And please continue to stay safe, drink to your health, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks.